few years ago, in Honolulu, one of our little students, who has since become my corresponding secretary, was having a few friends in, a few students, a couple of times a week, to hear a tape recording. And because our home was just about 100 feet from the hotel where I was living, I occasionally dropped in to hear one of the tapes. And as you might know, each time some question would be asked, or I'd feel impelled after a meditation to say a few words. And so one day this young lady just hooked up the tape recorder to be sure that if I did speak, that it would be recorded. And so whenever I dropped in on those meetings, something would be recorded on the tape. And I had no idea that it was anything of any unusualness or importance until several weeks had gone by and the meetings were all over. And I was sitting at breakfast on the lanai of the hotel, and Mrs. Lindsay had come in that morning early and was having breakfast with me, and in the midst of it, I said, those programs over Nidra's have never been completed. I think I could complete that now. I said, well, let's hurry. We jumped up, got in the car, and went over to the studio, and I did a tape that is now called God Is. And you know that those little books, those little talks became Living the Infinite Way. And much to my amazement, Living the Infinite Way seems to be running so far ahead of anything else in sales that I wonder where it's going to stop. The first printing was sold out before the delivery date, and now there's another printing out. And on reading it, I can see points in there that I realize that I've never had the courage or never felt called on to give in public. Well, last summer, just before I came to Chicago, I was in Seattle, and we had a practitioner's class. But in the midst of that class, I knew that something unusual was happening. I knew that something very out of the ordinary was taking place because of what was happening to me on the platform. And in that class, there came a tape which we called The Infinite Invisible. And when it was through, I had the feeling that it wasn't complete. And so the next morning I started out and finished it, which is called Christhood, or something like that. And I had the feeling then, and I have now, that Seattle practitioner class is probably one of the important writings of the message of the infinite way. And the reason is exactly that which has made living the infinite way astound many, many people. And I can assure you I've had letters from some very prominent people in spiritual and metaphysical work saying that they have been astounded by things that are in that book. Now, the point of that book is God is. And not in the sense that anyone doubted that God is, but that this book brings to light that God is as far as you can go with your statement. That if you go any further than that and say God is light, or God is life, or God is love, or God is anything else, that you're in hot water. Because you are declaring something of which you have no knowledge. You actually don't know that God is love. John knew it. John received that in inner illumination. But you don't know it. And as you look around the world, you'd hardly believe that God is love. And it is only those who do have an inner light that can become aware that in spite of all appearances to the contrary, and in spite of all our human woes, God is love. And when you make the eventual contact, you'll have the experience in life that will prove to you that God is love. But meanwhile, until then, even though you repeat the words, God is love, that's meaningless. You absolutely don't know it. You could say God is life, but you don't know that either. Because even if you were to point to the fact that we are living, and the trees are living, and the birds are living, there is also the fact that a lot of people are dead. And a lot of others will be. And so, for you to say God is life is really to be quoting. It's just an intellectual agreement with statements that others have made. Of course, when Jesus experienced God as life eternal, and when we were told that to know Him, God, aright, is life eternal, that came out of inner light or illumination. But until we have had that same inner light or illumination, if we say God is life, we are just quoting. And somebody very, very clever at debate might soon make you lose a debate on the subject of whether God is love or God is life. God is spirit or God is soul. You don't know anything about that at all. You just accept those statements. Certainly it says in the Bible that God is spirit. And you're willing to accept it. But there isn't any way that you have of proving it. And so as you follow this line of thought for a while, you will come ultimately face to face with yourself and say, now let's stop all this nonsense and all this fooling. I don't know anything about God except one thing. I know that God is. That I know. Beyond all doubt I know that. Why do I know that? Well, if there weren't any other reason, I am. And I certainly didn't make myself. The stars exist, and the moon, and the sun, and the tides, and I didn't make them, and I haven't heard about anybody else who did. Nobody seems to take credit for it at any rate. And so all I have to do is look out at the miracle of nature to know that there is a creative principle, to know that there's a God. Now that, I'm sure, that if you brought all the atheistic debaters from Harvard University to Oxford, that they could not win that argument against you. They could not overcome your conviction and your ability to be convincing about it, that God is. Now, when you are willing to acknowledge that you know nothing about God except by hearsay or through the experience of others, but that you yourself have this complete conviction that God is, then you are prepared to find out what God is and to experience God. Because now, instead of filling your head with other people's concepts and other people's views and opinions, you can shut that all out. Go within yourself and say, all right, God, I know that God is, but that's all I know. And now I need enlightenment, and I don't want enlightenment from a man whose breath is in his nostril. I want a demonstrable evidence that God is, what God is, and how God is. And I'm entitled to it. Because I'm entitled to all that the Father hath. All that the Father hath is mine. All the wisdom, all the light, all the understanding of the Father is mine. Herein is God glorified, that I bear fruit richly. The earth, the heavens declare the glory of God. The earth showeth forth his handiwork. Certainly I, who am the Son of God, am entitled to show forth more than these. But I can't do it going around parroting other people's ideas about God. I have to have the truth about God, and there's no place to get the truth except from God. Where did all the saints and seers get their understanding and wisdom about God? Why did they write books, and why are they quoted even after hundreds of years? Because what they received from God was so authentic that not even the publishers can stop publishing those books, much as they would prefer to publish Wild West stories and detective stories. Now, anybody sufficiently interested in God to make a study of God, to seek and search for God, and try to work out the human destiny through God, must have enough interest to put in the necessary amount of time and effort in contemplation, meditation, to come to the point where God reveals himself to you. You know that in the beginning of this unfoldment that came to me, there was a two-letter word that gave birth to the whole of the infinite way message. And that word is as. A-S. I had as much trouble as anybody else trying to find out how we could say that I and the Father are one, and then that there's a God in me, or a God in heaven, or a God here, there, and the other place. And it was only as I struggled with that an inner light came and said, God as. That took all the duality out of this universe. That made sense to the words. The Word became flesh. The Infinite Way starts off with that passage. The Word became flesh. The Word didn't send out flesh. The Word itself is flesh. And so I saw that that meant God became man. In other words, the Father became the Son. There I found again that the Bible agreed with me. The Father, the Son, the Holy Ghost. They're all one. They're not two, God the Father and another God the Son. God the Father is God the Son. And so I saw again, that's true. God didn't create a universe because there would be God, infinite being, and a universe, infinity and something else. No. Infinity appearing as something else. Then you don't have two infinities. And you don't have an infinity and something else. And so we had the birth, really, of the infinite way. But before the book was written, I had seen again that God is. And that's as far as we could go. Even though we agreed with everything Jesus said that God was a Father, nevertheless, as far as I'm concerned, a father is a male parent. And I haven't got any male parent inside of me. Nor have you. And that's the only meaning of father that I know. Now, of course, Jesus didn't mean that. So how do we know what he meant when he said God is Father? Well, maybe you know it. I still don't know what God as Father is. To me, the only meaning I get out of the word Father is a male parent, and certainly God isn't that. And when John speaks of God as love, I can tell you that I never understood that. As a matter of fact, it was only here about 3 years ago that I understood God as love. Up to that time, you will not find the word love in my writing, unless I'm quoting somebody. But you'll never find me speaking of God as love, because I knew nothing about God as love. I knew nothing about love itself. I've said this before. Love is one of those things I've just never understood. Probably helped to make me a failure as a husband, but nevertheless, I certainly did not understand love. I didn't understand love on the spiritual plane or on the human plane. Love was one of those words that evaded me. And I feel sure it's evaded a lot of other people too, only they don't acknowledge it, and so they go on using the word and trying to even believe that they know what love is. My experience came while walking to give a lecture out in Honolulu. I was on the way to the lecture hall at the Moana Hotel. And as I was walking up the street, I heard a voice say, "Won't you buy me a flower? Just a little flower?" And I turned around to see who wanted this flower. There wasn't anybody there. And I heard it again, but this time it was coming up out of here. Oh, my face lighted up. I said, "Jack, oh, sure I will." I turned around and I ran back, and just a block in back of me was Auntie Bella's little flower stand. I went up to Auntie Bella, "Please, can I have a couple little carnations? They make these carnation leis with them. Can I have a couple little carnations?" "Sure." So she took 2 little carnations and put a wire around them, and I walked down the street with this flower in my hand. Oh, smile. Didn't know where I was going or why. It must have looked terribly foolish to the rest of the world, but I went up to my platform and I put my little flowers there, my Bible here, and it was over an hour later. I had no idea what I was talking about, but I was talking about love. A whole hour of talking about love. When it was all over, I couldn't remember one word of it, and the recorder was out of order, and it didn't catch one single word of it. And but everybody sat. Nobody wanted to get up. I waited. Nobody wanted to get up. So I made the break, and I walked out to the door. And even then, it took them a while to get off their seats. And they told me it was electrifying. Maybe it was, but I have no recollection of it. Still don't know what I said. Nobody seems able to remember it. But it was all about love. And a couple of those who know me well said, "That's the first time we ever heard you mention the word." Well, nothing else happened until Seattle. And one evening, I found myself talking about love. And again, the tape recorder went out of order. It wasn't recorded. And again, nobody could tell me what I said about love. So Sunday morning, I was sure I was going to talk about love, and I did. And the girl got so interested listening to me, she forgot to turn the recorder on. And still, not one of us could remember what love was. But it was the following Thursday night, and the recorder was on, and it stayed on, and we got the message, Love and Gratitude, which is in the pamphlet. And that's my first conscious knowledge of what love is. And the reason I didn't know what it was before is that I thought love had something to do with you and me. And I found out that's not true. All love is of God. Love isn't of man at all. And when we love or when we're loving, it's really an activity of God going through us. When we are not in love or loving, it's just that God is absent from us, that's all. Because in a sense of separation from God, there's no love flowing. But in contact with God, love is flowing. And so it isn't flowing from any of us to anybody else. It's flowing through us. And so that's how I learned the mystery of love. Well, it was just in unfoldments like that I learned God as and God is. And then another experience came along. that showed the significance of that word is. It was at a period when Don Blanding was coming to me every morning at 7 o'clock for we'd have breakfast together and a lesson for 2 hours. And we were speaking of prayer. And this particular morning we were sitting opposite each other at the table, and always on the table there was a glass jug of maple syrup. The reason is that hot cakes are very popular out in the island. And here we are talking about prayer, or I'm talking, and some point or other wasn't very clear. The point had to do with why our prayers to God can never bring an answer. And all of a sudden my eyes lighted on this jug, and I said, "Don, what is this?" And Don said, "That's a jug of syrup." "Oh, it is?" "Yes, it is." Well, now, let's meditate. Let's close our eyes a minute and meditate for a jug of syrup. "Oh, well, that's not necessary." "That is a jug of syrup." All right, let's see if we can't find a good treatment, nice metaphysical treatment to make this a jug of syrup. But you can't. It is a jug of syrup. Well, I said, that's all there is to prayer. You can't make anything. God made everything in the beginning. God made everything in the beginning, and everything that he made, he advertises to be very good. And he's the originator of truth in advertising. But he says so himself, everything that God made is good. And so you see, there isn't any reason for us to meditate, to make anything good. There isn't any reason for us to give anybody a treatment to make them good or to make them well. There's only one thing needful on our part, since we have been so misled on spiritual things, as to have wandered way off into the maze of praying to God to do something. What we have to do is to come down to earth again, or go up to heaven and declare, "Oh no, forgive me, Father, for such audacity." God is, perfection is, harmony is. Is the only word, not was. There's no fallen man. There is a fallen concept of man. If we think that we are human beings, we are entertaining a false concept of man. But that doesn't mean that we are human beings, because if God is spirit, we are spiritual. There's no question about that. That God made this universe out of himself, and it remains himself in form and manifestation. And so we won't pray God to make this maple syrup. Our prayer will be the recognition it is maple syrup, and then we'll just pick it up and use it. Now, that same type of unfoldment in me led to the term infinite invisible. Why? Well, I suppose Lao Tse started it. You know, he starts his manuscript with, "If you can name it, it isn't that." And people read that and smile and pass on and let it go, not realizing that in that statement they are really enabled to tear up all the Bibles in the world and start living. Because if you once acknowledge that no name is sufficient to describe or unfold or reveal God, you will find yourself out on a limb with a saw. Because now you're in the position of having to think of God but without a name. And that's a tight place to be in, isn't it? to have to tell me what God is but not use a name or a description of nature or character. And you find it pretty nigh impossible until some divine grace gives you the term infinite invisible. And now you can say, because nobody knows what an infinite is, and nobody knows what the invisible is, it's all right to say God is the infinite invisible because you haven't said anything. You haven't described a thing, you haven't told a thing about God, you haven't named God. Because nobody in this world, in the human sense of things, can ever know the infinite. How can finiteness know infinity? If you could transcend your mind and rise into spiritual awareness, then you would not only know infinity, but be infinity. In the same way, you can't see the invisible, you can't hear the invisible, or taste it, or touch it, or smell it. But if you could rise above human sense, you would not only be aware of the invisible, but you'd be invisible. So that it's a fair exchange of words to say God, which I don't know, is the infinite invisible, which I also don't know. Now, just think of what you're saying if you use the term infinite invisible for God. It means that you've said something that your mind can't grasp. And if your mind can't grasp it, that's it. If your mind can grasp it, that's not it. If you can name it, that isn't it. If you can describe it, that isn't it. If you can visualize it, that isn't it. If you can have any kind of a thought about what God is or what God is like, that isn't it. Those are all finite concepts that you're entertaining. And the only time you get close to the truth is when you say it's just hopeless. God is infinite and I can't grasp that. And God is invisible, I can't grasp that. And then you're very close to God. Because the very moment you acknowledge I can of my own self do nothing, then you'll find the Father comes along and doeth the works. Now, it came out in that tape which you were to have here tonight. Probably are having it. That you must, one by one, lay aside every concept you have of God and say, that's not it. Oh yes, the Hindus have something like that in their manuscripts too. Not that, they call it. Neddy-deddy. Not that, not that. You say this, no, not that, not that, not that. They keep on saying not that forever. You couldn't possibly say anything that would make them say that's it. No, it's always not that, not that. If you go far enough out on the limb with that not that, you come face to face with it. Because the minute you get outside the confines of the human mind, you're there. Now, in this that I am telling you, there is still another principle of the infinite way revealed. And that is that when you don't know anything, and know you don't, and come to an impasse, and your mind stops, the Father rushes in and does the work and tells you all about it. So that is the secret of infinite way living. In other words, when I am sitting in Hawaii and I'm busy every day, and you can't have any idea how busy I've been the last 3 months, except that I tell you that our staff has just grown and grown and grown and grown till we have secretaries and secretaries. We bought another set of dictaphones this year and 2 electric typewriters and heaven knows how many desks and equipment for the growing staff. And yet, in the midst of all that, I run down to the air office and buy tickets to come to Portland, Chicago, and Seattle. Now, you know, I didn't make that up out of my head. But because I wasn't making something up, because I wasn't planning each day, I was merely doing each day what was given to me to do, my mind was open And when it said go, it didn't take long to call up the lady who takes care of my transportation and tell her I'm on the way. And I said, you got to hurry that ticket. She said, I know you want it yesterday. I'm used to you. Now, it is in the same way that we will assume that you have a problem. And if you have come this far in the message of the infinite way, you probably know that there is no way for you to reason out a solution of it. If you could, you would be doing it through human wisdom or psychology. And if you went to a metaphysical practitioner and they gave you advice, you'd be justified in saying, this is my last visit here. Because I didn't come for advice, I came for God guidance. Now, if you've come this far, you know that if you have a problem or someone comes to you with a problem, that you have no right to give them an answer. You have the right to say, let us pray, or let us go to the Father, or let us meditate. Whatever term you like, really doesn't make any difference. How you word it, rose by any name, is just as sweet. So whether you say, let us pray, or let us meditate, or let us go to God, or let us be still, it all means the same thing. And so, at this stage of your unfoldment, instead of giving a treatment, instead of indulging in metaphysical cliches like, oh, it isn't true, dearie, or, oh, now you know God will take care of it, or, oh, it isn't real. Don't do that with the infinite way. You would put your finger on your lips and say nothing. Nothing that I could say about your problem is true. And nothing I could say or think about your problem will solve it. Let's go to God. And so you would perhaps close your eyes, and there again it wouldn't make a difference if you didn't. It's a habit we've acquired. And instead of thinking thoughts, instead of trying to make up a good treatment, or instead of trying to voice all the metaphysical things you've heard somewhere, you say, what's the good of all that? Those are just quotations. Those are just statements. Those are just vain repetitions. Let me sit here peacefully, because anyhow God has to solve it. And so, without a single attempt to help your problem or your patients or your students or your friends, you would sit as quietly as your demonstration would permit you, in a receptive state of consciousness, a receptive state of thought. And you would remain there as long as you could, 2, 3, 4 minutes. And if you didn't get the feeling that the problem was met, that God was on the field, you could come back to it in an hour or 2 or 3, sit down again. It may be that you'd think some thoughts or make some metaphysical statements, but you wouldn't fool yourself in believing that that was going to help anybody. That was merely to quiet your own thought. And again you'd wait 2 or 3 minutes, and you might get the feeling that, it's all right, God's on the field, all's well. Or you might not. And so, 2, 3, 4 hours later, you might sit down again for 6 hours or 12 hours. But sooner or later, if you were faithful to that practice, you would get the answer and the healing would take place. Or help would come forth. It doesn't necessarily follow that you'll always have an instantaneous healing, or that everybody you help will get their healing, because there are things involved in healing work that are far more than just the fact that you rise to spiritual consciousness. On the whole, it is true that when you get your click, when you have your feeling of oneness, that God is on the field and something's going to take place. But you'll be surprised occasionally to find that the healing didn't take place the way the patient expected it, or even the way you thought it would come through, or when you thought it would come through. And that will not be your fault. Nor will there be any use of blaming your patient. That will be because the situation is not yet in such a shape as to permit the divine harmony to appear. You say, what governs that? What controls it? Well, many things. You see, a spiritual ministry is something more than just healing people's bodies or purses. The healing of the body or the purse is incidental to the main part of a spiritual ministry, which is the enlightening or illumination of the soul, the opening of the soul, bringing a person to the kingdom of God. That is your major factor in a spiritual ministry. Because when they come to the kingdom of God, to the realization of God, then all other things are added unto them. But you can't bring them harmony separate and apart from their being brought into the kingdom of God. Because their harmony is the kingdom of God expressed. In other words, if you have a cold and you ask someone for help, that help doesn't do anything to your cold. It doesn't act on your body. It lifts your consciousness higher into God awareness, and that God awareness goes through the whole system and purifies, or dispels the illusion and reveals divine harmony. But if your patient or student is still down on their mortal level, nothing happens to their body, or if it does, it happens through your upliftment. And then later they have to go through it again anyhow, because they haven't achieved it. You remember, the master in healing says, go and sin no more, lest the worst thing come upon you. In other words, he had healed them through his uplifted state of consciousness, but he's warning them, if this hasn't lifted your consciousness above mortal material ways, a worse thing than this is going to come on you. So it is that many times a patient will not respond to your spiritual uplift until they themselves have felt and received a measure of uplift, and you may have to work with them a month or a year or 3 years or 5 years, depending how engrossed in materiality their thought is, their consciousness. That has nothing to do with them as humans. I mean by that we don't criticize or condemn anybody. If we did, I'd be in a sad position. It took me an awful lot of years to get to first base. I was very slow in yielding. And I have a good many friends in this work too who have been very slow in yielding. It's not their fault. It may have to do with prenatal experiences. It may have to do with pre-existence. Can't give you the answers on that. I do know this, that there are some people so spiritually endowed that when they come in contact with my work, sometimes the very first time of contact, they're lifted right up to the gates of heaven. And they know it. They don't all experience the fullness of their spiritual living in that one, but they know they've achieved it, and the rest is going to come through unfoldment, and it does. There are other people that I've worked with months before it happened, some years. And there's some I've worked with years and it hasn't happened yet. Now, I have no way of blaming them, because the responsibility rests with me to be so lifted up that I draw all men unto my state of consciousness. But that is no assurance that everyone is going to be lifted up today. We have no greater example of that than the Master. He had poor old Peter with him 3 years and made a mess of it. He had Judas with him 3 years, and what's become of those other disciples, no man knoweth. And they all had the privilege of 3 years of living with the Master. Now, in the same way, Buddha has only left 2 of any account. Lao Tzu only left 1 of any account. There were others at different degrees. It is the teacher's responsibility to live so in tune with a spiritual being that everyone who touches him derives some measure of benefit from. But the measure of benefit actually is the lifting up in consciousness into a lessening of the mortal and material sense. And then with that, the errors of body and purse and mind and habits drop away. And that is why you may at times receive absolutely the very words in your ear, he is healed or she is healed, and still find out that 6 months later your patient hasn't reached there. Now, in that case, there's only one thing to do. You must be faithful to your patient or your student as long as they want to stay with you. They really are the ones who are struggling harder than you are. You have achieved some measure of Christ consciousness. You are in it, and all you have to do is to live in it to the highest of your ability. So you're not going out of your way for them because you'd be doing it for yourself anyhow. And as long as you are patient with them, they'll ultimately come to it if they stick. Once they want to drop away, you let them drop away with grace. Don't hold on to anyone. Let anyone drop away that wants to, because they will ultimately meet their problem on one level or another, through one individual or another, through one teaching or another. And it isn't given to everybody to make their demonstration in Christian Science or unity or infinite way. It just isn't. There is no teaching yet known capable of opening the whole world. There are still those who can be reached through other means. And so it is that one person may come to you and may really require somebody of a deeper spiritual nature than you have attained. Or they may not be able to respond to a spiritual impulse and might do far better under a mental teacher, a teacher of mental science. There have been wonderful, wonderful healings in mental science by mental practitioners of integrity. I know that there's been a horrible amount of hocus-pocus in that mental science field, a lot of heartaches and disappointment because of the vast amount of people in it, little or no true integrity. But when you find a practitioner of mental science who is a man or woman of deep integrity, and if you can respond to the mental level of consciousness, you might have the very thing that will bring about your healing and set you free to go higher into the spiritual realm. So we never speak of either the physical, mental, or spiritual realms with condemnation or criticism. There are those people who must have medicine, must have plasters, must have surgery because they have no way of responding to anything else. That is their level of consciousness. And if you could give them a pink sugar pill, many of them could be healed of cancer and consumption, because that is their level of consciousness. And that's nothing to be condemned about. They can't help that any more than you might be able to help that you don't respond to an aspirin tablet. There are many, many people in our work who, even if they took an aspirin tablet, wouldn't benefit by it, but rather would get sick to their stomach. I've seen it over and over and over, that people suffering and having a great deal of work to do would say, oh, well, give me an aspirin and I'll get forgiven tomorrow and start over again, but I must have some relief. And they take their aspirin and get pretty sick over it. But that is because they have risen above the physical level of life. Now, we don't criticize or judge that level. We just know it is one of the three levels of consciousness. And the same with the mental. We want in our work as little as we can of mental work, just as little as we can get along with. Not because we judge it, criticize it, or condemn it, but because to most of us it is a level of consciousness of which we have outgrown in some degree. Not entirely, I can assure you of that. No one on earth ever outgrows the mental level completely, because the mental level is our major level of human existence. The spiritual level is only a major level to the few who have overcome the world. That is, overcome the physical and mental level. To them, the spiritual is the major, but it doesn't mean that the mental and physical doesn't still play some part. Because in everyone who we've ever known on earth, including Jesus, even up to the last minute, both the mental and the physical played some part. Because you can't say that he didn't show forth wounds in his body, or that he wasn't taken down, if not dead, unconscious from the cross, showing that he responded both to the physical and the mental levels of consciousness, in a lesser degree than we will, because he had gone further. And because he had gone further, in the quietness of the tomb, he was able to overcome the effects of both the physical and the mental level and rise above both of them. And so it is. We are, at the present time, a mixture of the physical, the mental, and the spiritual. The spiritual is the only true one and real one. The other two are these worlds that make up the human experience. The very fact that we came into some form of metaphysical study shows that we had already been given a divine grace that lifted us above the physical realm to a great extent. In other words, we were not responding to help on the physical level, or we wouldn't have tried the mental level. And then we tried the mental level, and then we tried a combination of the mental and the spiritual, and now we're trying our best to abide only in the spiritual. But I'm showing you how difficult it is by telling you that you're only abiding in the spiritual when you're abiding without thought. When you can approach God, not with God as love, or God is good, or God will take care of me, but with merely God is, you've given up a great deal of your mental prerogative. And when you can stop using the human mind to reach God, or to bring some good into your experience, when you can stop taking thought for your life, what you shall eat or what you shall drink, or wherewithal you shall be clothed, when you can stop making metaphysical cliches, affirmations and denials, and when someone presents a problem to you, look right through them blankly as if you hadn't heard them, then you are in the spiritual. But if you catch yourself responding with, now it isn't true, you're back in the mental. You've tried to refute, to argue. That's back in the mental. You see, to be in the spiritual, you have to agree with your adversary. And so if the adversary says, you know, you're hungry, you just have to say, yes, I'm hungry, so what? And if the adversary says, you know, you're dying, you have to say, sure, I'm dying, so what? Has it a power? When I find God there, it's all right with me then. Let me starve, let me die. And the adversary says, you're on the way to hell, and you say, sure, I'll find God there. So what difference does it make? You see, you don't argue, you don't refute, you don't mentalize, you don't try to avoid or overcome or rise above. You just agree. Somebody says, oh, I'm dying. You say, oh, isn't that nice? I haven't had the opportunity to say that to anyone, but I heard it said by a Christian Science teacher. My wife called for help. She said, oh, I just know I'm dying. This is my last night on earth. And he says, oh, he said, that's nice. Oh, he said, that's fine. Won't you be happy to wake up and find out what a wonderful experience lies ahead of you? You know, I envy you. Be that so close to And that broke the spell, too. You see, he wasn't refuting or arguing. I had the experience of answering a mother. I can be awfully cruel with mothers. I've never been one, so I don't know what their feeling is like. I can be awfully cruel. And this one called up, and my child has a high fever, and it keeps getting higher, and I'm scared. Will you do some work for it? Sure, right away. Well, I don't know how you can reach this child. My fears are so terrible that I'm sure I'm holding my child in bondage. Oh, I don't think so. No, you go ahead and fear. Keep on fearing. In fact, why don't you go in the next room and order a pot of coffee and just stay up all night fearing, get it out of your system. What? I thought that my fears were holding the child in bondage. Oh, come. You knew all the time that God was the only power. Now, what power could your fears have? No, don't cheat yourself. I know how mothers feel about their children because I've heard all about it, and I know how they fear for them, and I know it's a pleasure. You go right back there and enjoy yourself. Get it all out of your system. And she called back in about an hour and said, I don't understand it, but I'm healed and the child is healed. Agree with that. Don't make matters worse by saying, oh, mother, you'll have to stop fearing. First thing you know, you'll be telling them they have to stop seeing blackbirds. Now, the minute you tell a person to stop fearing, you're just filling them with fear because they know something terrible is going to happen if they don't stop fearing. The moment you tell a drinker to stop drinking, you've got him hooked for life as an alcoholic because he knows right well now that he's in a terrible plight. Now the person with drugs or any other way. You see, you can't rationalize a healing. God doesn't work through rationalization or reason. You can't rationalize. You can't know how God operates. But when a problem is presented to you, you can agree that God is. And if God is, what difference does anything else make? My only fear would be if I ever commenced to suspect that God isn't. Then I would be in a turmoil. Because then I wouldn't know what's going to happen to the world. But my anchor is that I know God is. And so knowing that God is, I can rest in that is. Just rest there and wait. If I wait enough hours, the light will come. Light always comes. Morning always comes after night. And in our work, very often, the healings only come after our darkest and deepest experiences. And again, you can see the reason for that. Supposing you were a fisherman, professional fisherman, and your family lived off of what you earned through fishing. And your community got its taxes through what you paid from your earnings from fishing. And nobody in that town knew any other way of making a living than fishing. And everybody was well taken care of through fishing. And supposing somebody came along one day shouting down Main Street, leave your nets and follow me. Now what do you think would happen to you? Leave my nets? That's how I earn. What am I going to do with my family? How's this town going to get along without fish? Leave your nets? Don't you mean get more nets? No, leave your nets. Now, that doesn't make sense, does it? Anybody tell you to leave nets? No. Any more than if somebody were to tell you, leave your job right now. Leave your job and come follow me. Well, not many of you would do it, if any. It has been done. There's someone right near here who has a whole staff of employees, and not one of them receive a penny of salary. They keep right on living and working, and day in and day out, year in and year out. They just left their nets, that's all, but they seem to go on living. But not many people would respond to a call like that because it isn't common sense. It doesn't satisfy reason. But you see, it follows a spiritual impulse that always fulfills itself. I've told you the story that when I was having business difficulties, that I went to a practitioner for help to increase my business, and the business got less. I went to another practitioner, and it got still less. So I had to find a third practitioner, and it got still less. And then one day a young woman said to me, and incidentally she was in my last New York class, she said, "Did you ever stop to think that you're a practitioner?" Me, a practitioner? Don't be foolish. You got to be a good person to be a practitioner. I'm not in that category. Oh, don't be foolish. You are a practitioner. Thank you, ma'am, but I'm going to keep praying for more business. And I met a Christian Science teacher the next week, and I told him what I was going through. And I said, I don't understand it. I've really had 3 fine practitioners, and the more they work for me, the worse my business gets. And he looked at me and he said, "Did you ever stop to think that maybe you're a practitioner?" I said, "I wish you people could get sensible. First place, I don't know enough about Christian Science to be a practitioner. Secondly, I don't know anything, period. I'm not a practitioner." Well, the following Monday when I went to my office, my associate said, "Why don't you wake up? Don't you know you're a practitioner?" And you know, I said 3 times is out. And I quit, and I went uptown to the Greystone Hotel, and I hired an office. Put up a sign, practitioner. That was a stupid thing to do. I didn't have 5 cents income from business anymore, and not from the practice. I was helping some people, but they knew I was in business, so they weren't paying me anything. And there I was, a practitioner without a practice. 1 month's rent paid in advance. Now you see, that doesn't make sense. And I could bring to you right now a dozen people who said so at the time. Told me right to my face I was crazy, that didn't make sense. Well, I think they still think so. But they haven't come to see the spiritual way. They still think I'd have made a great businessman. In fact, they're sure of it, as sure as I am that the business was going to pot and I wasn't getting anywhere. Now, I say that to you for this reason. If someone says to you, "I'm in terrible pain," probably it is reasonable metaphysically to say to them, "Oh, it isn't true," or "it isn't real." But don't satisfy that reason, because it won't get you anywhere. Saying it isn't true or saying it isn't real isn't going to do a thing. It may be that you follow some teaching that says you are spiritual, and so you might turn around and say, "Why, don't you know you're spiritual or the Son of God?" You may even follow one of these teachings that say, "I am God," and so you turn around and say, "Why, you can't have pain. Don't you know you are God?" Well, I really don't care whether you call him a worm in the dust or a son of God or God. They're going to have the same pain when you get through. It isn't going to do a thing to them. You might just as well make up your mind to give no answer and not be sensible and not respond to reason. Just keep still and know that God is. And you will find that as you learn that God is appearing as individual being, and so doesn't need a treatment, and as you know that God is, and therefore harmony is, that you won't have to make these statements. And if you do make them, it won't do you any good, because the statements are made with your mind, and that is not power.